Sometimes, when it comes to making bass lines, it feels like we're doing the same thing over and over again. You just create your rolling bass line, duplicate it over a couple of times and just leave it there. At least, that's what I used to do until I started this production here. I'm going to play quite a bit of it, so sit back and enjoy it. I did just recently start this production. It is very different from the stuff that I normally do. As you can see, this is 175 BPM and this is a lot darker than the music that I normally write. But there are several ideas that I want to show from this project and maybe I'll even do a full breakdown once it's finished. For now, just enjoy the little preview that I have for you today.
My name
Now, before we continue, I quickly want to say that if you want to support the channel, make sure that you're subscribed and that you like the video. You can also support me financially by checking out my products on Gumroad, like my sample packs, my preset packs and my masterclass, or by supporting me on Patreon, where you get benefits like early access to videos, priority in feedback streams, as well as many other benefits. Links for both of them are going to be in the description. Now let's get back into the video. So as you can hear, a lot of crazy stuff going on, definitely not your standard rolling bass line. And the way that I'm writing this track is a little bit special. I start off with a section just like this, which is in its current state right here, where it is just the rolling kick and bass and there's no modifications made. In this case, I don't think I'll be doing any modifications here, apart from the one that you see right here, where there's a double kick here. But here you can see that apart from the groove that sits in this section, no modifications have been made yet. It is just the rolling kick and bass pattern over and over again. In fact, this is a 2-bar pattern here and it just duplicates over in the exact same way. But if I go before here, you can see that it becomes a lot more complex. There's a lot more melodic stuff happening. There's a lot more groove stuff happening in that there's notes missing, that there's notes replaced with a kick here. Now, the way that I'm structuring things is that I'm mostly writing still in the traditional way of writing. In this case, I do it with 8-bar sections. You can see that especially here where I haven't made all of the modifications yet, that this is just an 8-bar section and this is just an 8-bar section. But even here, you can see that there's a big fill right here. There's a kick fill thing happening here with the melodic bass line. There's another big fill happening here where the kick and bass temporarily stops. Now right here you can see that there's one exception. In this part the kick and bass just kind of continues. Yes, there's a few edits here or there, but it's nothing much. The fill actually kind of sits here, which is actually 4 bars late. So you can see here's the last fill that we saw. You would expect it to be around here, just 8 bars before it if you wanted to go off the sections. But in this case, it sits right here, and this is actually the only exception on that rule so far in the track. You can see here is another fill. In this case, the bass continues, but the kick stops. And again, this is exactly in line with our structure because it's 8 bars after the drop begins. Now, the beginning of the drop is already very interesting because there's almost like 2 beginnings to it. There's the one that I've highlighted now, and then there's this one right here. And the reason for that is because I'm doing a real cool vocal effect where the vocal delay kind of morphs into the beginning of the drop. It then stops, and then the kick and bass just kind of comes through on its own. And you can hear that I have some effects that facilitate that. You can hear that we have the crash going into this part here, and then we have the downlifter from this part here, or the atmosphere from that part there. That's that very high kind of sine wave spike, which was actually made with a frequency shifter. So we get this kind of delayed start feeling, but it kind of neatly morphs from the vocal into a combination of the vocal and the drop, and then just the drop with the effect that is playing on it. We can also already see the first automation. This macro is actually used to control the filter, so you can see it just opens up the filter a little bit more, and that way you get a little bit of a grittier bass line in that part. Later you will hear it here as well. And this is a great way to emphasize certain parts of the kick and bass. You can hear it emphasizes this first part here, and then it emphasizes the part that sits right before the part where the kick is removed and there's an extra bass note. This is almost like an announcement of something that is about to happen. Now that together with the melodies changes the bass line continuously, and you can see no single portion is exactly the same, and I'm always writing around new ideas. The way that you go through this is just very linearly. You write out all of the elements in the loop like we saw before, like we saw in this space here, and then you just go in there and you add these little extra moments to the bass line by, as I said, just changing the melody, changing this modulation here that opens the filter a little bit. Maybe you can use some extra kicks. As we can see right here, there's some extra kicks in here. We have this reverse kick in there, and then we have this double kick in here. Those are both very common elements for this kind of stuff. Here you can see another little kick roll happening here. One of the important things to keep into account is when you're doing this, make sure that you're adding fades to the kick. As you can see, what you wanted to do is you wanted to fade back to 0 or fade back to silence right before the next transient hits. That way the transient of all of the kicks isn't being destroyed by whatever is happening before it. Especially when you're filtering, the post-ringing will actually morph into this transient. So we don't want that to happen, but what we also don't want to happen is for this track to be very loud right before the kick transient. We want it to become a little bit quieter, so that when the kick transient hits, it actually increases the loudness again and it has a lot more punch that way. In fact, if we go back into this reverse kick the way that you would probably want to do it, as you can see, it doesn't go back to silence. For a reverse kick even, as you can see, I just wanted to take it down a little bit like this. You can also see that I'm not using the exact beginning of the kick. I like to cut it right about here where it just swoops in on the bass, and then the transient actually comes in with a lot of higher frequencies, and also that gives it a lot of extra impact. But back to the bass line, one of the main things that I'm doing to keep it interesting is sometimes removing the kick actually as opposed to using extra kicks. And then we have space to play a little bit more with the bass line and to do a little bit more in terms of effects. The main effect that I'm using for this is M stereo spread, which is awesome. What I'm doing is I'm increasing the spread amount, which is going to be the overall stereo width, and then I'm also saturating heavily the stereo width part of the signal, so that gives it even more volume. And you can hear what that does to the stereo width of the bassline. It becomes very, very stereo for a moment. And overall it has this kind of neat growly effect. And because we already tested M stereo spread and we know that it's fully mono compatible, this is not going to ruin your bassline for the dance floor. Of course, if you play it on the mono system, you're not going to hear this effect as predominantly. There might be some coloration that is happening, but I would attribute that mainly to the opening of the filter as well. In theory, this effect right here should cancel out completely in mono. You can see that this fill is not the only part where I use it. Sometimes it is neat to accentuate a few notes like this, where just one of the notes is a little bit wider, as opposed to something like this. Now keep in mind, even when I'm not bumping it up like this, it is still contributing a little bit of stereo width. If we loop this part here, we can see that. But I'm mainly focusing it on the higher frequencies and mainly the click. But when you're saturating it like this, it really starts to apply on the whole signal. So also the mid-range kind of growliness and the grittiness is a little bit wider and a little bit more saturated. Some other cool effects that I'm using is removing the last bass note. Here's a cool example of that. This gives the kick and bass a lot of power because it doesn't really finish. And that means that there's a lot more space in here, a lot more silence in here for the kick itself to come through more. Listen to how clear that transient is as opposed to, for example, here. Here again, you can see another idea for a fill. We're playing both with the filter as well as the stereo effect here. As you can see, for this one beat, we're bumping it up again. This gives this really nice switching effect. And you can hear that we're complementing that with an extra kick on here, and then it just continues into the beat again. One of the things to note here for this fill is that it changes in key here. It goes up by a semitone. What this does is it just kind of takes you out of your comfort area. I am writing this in Frisian, so it would be in scale, but it is a little bit strange that it just goes up by one semitone. It feels a little bit off. But once you hear it coming back down, what you'll realize is that it gives a little bit of extra weight to the bass line that actually sits in the drop, and therefore it feels a little bit darker when it's in the drop as opposed to in this fill because of that one semitone difference. It is a very small difference, though. You could obviously exaggerate it by going up even further, but you can hear what kind of effect that gives. As opposed to something like this. Now, I've just been giving you examples of the kick and bass soloed, but I'm never really listening to it soloed. What I do is I already have my elements in here, and then I just try to adapt the bass line to the other elements that are already in there for them to actually work out and stand out. What I usually try to do is accentuate different elements of the track as they get introduced or as they are playing. As you can see here, this layer's on top of this. Right here, this element is actually sliding into this point here. It just opens up over this period of time. And then after that, there's this segment where the kick is removed and it is replaced with a bass note here. So you get this really dragged out feeling for the kick and bass. And it sounds a little bit lame on its own, like it doesn't really make sense on its own. But once you include all of the other elements, as well as all of the other drums, this crash stuff here, and the other effects that are in here, it really glues it all together. The final idea that I want to show for today's video is this one here, and that's what I'm doing with the groove. So this kick is actually a fairly short kick. It is bleeding a little bit into this segment over here, into this beat over here. So we need a little bit of a lower velocity so that it doesn't go too loud here. That would obviously be the combination of the kick and bass. We can take a look at that on Syscope here, and we can just maybe take one of these here, and we'll just solo this. And what you can see is that this bass note is a little bit louder than this one here, so that this together sums up in not too high of a peak. If we make this bass note any louder, the peak is going to be so high that it becomes hard to mix. But what you'll see is that this bass note is also lower in volume. And I just do that through the velocity. As you can see, if I open up the velocity a little bit more, you can just see that the central one is a little bit higher than the other two. An extra benefit of this is that you get this really nice accentuated offbeat sound. And I'm using that idea all over the place by really accentuating the offbeat with other elements as well. Here you can see we have an offbeat kick. If I scroll back, you'll see a lot of offbeat snares here. So for example, here, here, this is an offbeat snare. You can see more offbeat kicks happening. We have a lot of offbeat stuff throughout the whole track that just helps accentuate that strong idea of the strong offbeat. And that makes the track a lot more danceable because it gets that strong offbeat feeling. I think when it comes to these really fast genres, what can happen is that it works really well for a bass line to just be at the same volume like we see, for example, in high tech. And in that case, what tends to be the case is that the kick is significantly louder than the bass line, maybe like 2-3 dB, something like that. But here it's 1, maybe half a dB louder. So I get this nice bouncing effect that works really well on this higher BPM track because it almost halves the speed of the track. It's like these bass notes matter a little bit less, and therefore we only concentrate on the kick and this offbeat bass note here. Now you can hear the hats help as well, and obviously the other bass notes aren't completely removed. They're still contributing to the low frequencies and stuff like that. It just creates a nice groove for the overall track. And as I said, the important thing is that you write around that idea with other elements in the track, maybe even with some of the one-shots and stuff like that. When it comes to stuff like the clap, what I've also done is I've gone with a very groovy clap, this nice like hand clap stuff here. And you can hear that when we have a section like this, where we also have the offbeat hi-hats, this closed hi-hat here, and the faster hi-hats as well, that you create this really energetic, but still this very bouncy and groovy feeling. So those were some of the creative bassline ideas that I'm using for this track. I hope that you enjoyed the video and that you can implement some of these ideas in your own productions. But that's going to be it for today. I hope to see you in the next one. Bye bye.